Welcome to the Relationships Inside Out podcast with Doctors Gregory Siebert and Kimberly Murray, licensed marriage and family therapists. Join them on this journey as they explore the ins and outs of relationships.
Well, welcome to Relationships Inside Out, where today we welcome Andrea Caggiano, licensed clinical social worker and sex therapist, and we are going to get kinky today.
Welcome. And those who are listening do know that we updated our set. So you can see that on YouTube as well. We just wanted to highlight that so you can see Andrea's face, see our faces, not just hear our beautiful voices.
I really don't want anyone to look at us, but that's okay.
It's good. It's good for you, Greg. Good. So Andrea, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
We're glad to have you. Do you want to share a bit about yourself, your clinical training?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Andrea. As introduced, I'm a sex therapist here in Fort Collins. I kind of came to sex therapy in a little bit of a winding road, which I'm hearing is kind of common for sex therapists, and not a lot of us go into sex therapy like right out of the gate. But my interest in sex therapy, sexual health, sexual wellness started really early. So in my graduate degree program, I was a TA for human sexuality for the intro to psychology folks. And it was a blast. It was so much fun. But then I kind of like meandered away from that. I started my clinical work, working mostly with kids, teens, families, and couples. Did that for a bunch of years. And then about 2016, 2017, I was working in a group practice at the time. And I went to my clinical director and I said, hey, I need somebody other than kids, teens, and couples, like give me some variety here. And so I started working with a few adults and they happened to be kinky. And that was like super interesting and super exciting. And I quickly found out that I had so much to learn. And so I went to my clinical director and I was like, help. And so he connected me with a certified sex therapist here in Fort Collins who has since become my mentor. And that really just kicked off this passion in terms of sex therapy. So in the few years after that, I devoured books and podcasts and attended workshops. And then when I had the opportunity to open up my private practice in 2021, I knew it was like the moment, right, where I could make the big change and switch over to a different niche. And so I went for it. So I opened a sex therapy specific practice in 2021 and then enrolled in my sex therapy certification program in 2022, which I am in the process of finishing up. All my coursework is done. I have to finish a final project and do 3 more hours of supervision. And then I am sending it off for approval, which I'm really excited about. Yeah, so close.
That's very exciting. Do you mind sharing or defining a little? So it's first sex therapy for those listening, and then also kink. You've that a couple times.
Yeah, absolutely. So sex therapy is really specialized talk therapy. The way that I like to compare it for folks so that they better understand it is just think about any other niche where somebody has gone through a tremendous amount of additional training to specialize in something. So it's just simply therapy that specializes in sex, sexual health, sexual wellness, sexual dysfunction, all of that kind of stuff. But it is still talk therapy. We are still licensed professionals. There is no like touching in sex therapy. It's, just therapy specializing in sex. And then in terms of kink, y'all, I could talk about the definition of kink all day. Okay, so like the super official definition of kink is any non-mainstream sexual interest or activity that deviates from societal norms and expectations. It's very kind of proper, right? Proper definition of kink. But I totally take, oh, go ahead.
Oh, very.
Very
Basically
proper.
What I hear is like anything other than missionary. Like that's what I hear.
There you go. And this is why I take issue with that definition, because it's so subjective and there's just like so much wiggle room there. And so I feel like it kind of it does a disservice to the definition of kink because it is so like broad at that point. It's interesting because folks will often ask me, like, why is it called kink or why is it called kinky? Where did that actually come from? So it actually comes from like the literal non-sexual definition of the word kink. which is a bend or a twist in something that's usually straight and narrow. Isn't that interesting?
Never thought about that.
Bendy.
Yeah.
Wow. That's one way you could say it. That's a choice.
Right? There you go. And the word originated way back in the day when the straight and narrow normal sex was heterosexual, monogamous, missionary, and for reproduction, right? And then anything that deviated outside of that was kink and alternative and seen in that way. And so that's why I take issue with this definition of kink, because it is so subjective. So, somebody could say, yeah, I'm really kinky. Sometimes my partner and I incorporate light spanking into our play. And somebody else can be like, well, yeah, I'm kinky. Like needle play happens every Wednesday, and that's just what we do. So there's just such a range in terms of how to define it. And I really believe that people should be empowered to self-define, right? If they feel like they're kinky, cool, embrace that. And the last thing I'll say about this is I think what often happens because it's such a spectrum is that people can try and kind of like out kink each other. And I remind folks it like does not need to become the kinky Olympics where people are like trying to compare.
It's got a visual. Isn't that bad?
Yeah. So, yeah.
I'm so glad you spoke on all of that because it's true, right? Even as Greg and I are sitting here, how we might define kink might look very different, right? And so I love that you break it down in that way. And kink, I think, gets a bad rap as being like deviant or dark or bad. I don't know. The way you describe it, it shows that it's not. Like, no.
So based on what we just talked about, anyone who's listening who's judging, if you're anything but missionary, you're kinky.
Yes.
Welcome to the club. We'll hand out
Welcome.
your members only card. Yeah.
You've used a blind
toy. Wear the pin with pride. Yes.
So I'm curious too. So what do these sessions look like? As a couples therapist, it's already a very vulnerable space. People already have hesitation coming, especially heterosexual couples. And I'm going to stereotype here, male clients in particular are very, they have a lot of aversion to going to therapy in general. And then you talk about sex therapy and then even kink. And it's like, this gets even more vulnerable and vulnerable. But what does that look like? What's that process look like?
Really good question. And this is an expectation that I set with my clients from the beginning. I'll get some folks who in consultation will say, well, here's what I'm dealing with. Do you think that we'll be able to address this in like 4 to 6 sessions? And I'm like, absolutely not. Like this is definitely going to be a process. And it's because of what you just spoke to. This is really, really vulnerable stuff. And so, as a sex therapist, I want to really honor that and approach that with care. And so I let my folks know, like, we're going to lay the groundwork, especially when working with couples. They're not only talking about this stuff with me, but they're talking about this stuff with each other in front of another person and being witnessed, right? So those are really, really vulnerable things. And so I take a lot of time in the beginning of the work and do like regular therapy, right? To lay the groundwork in terms of that trust, communication, building rapport. So I think it's a helpful expectation to set that the first couple of months are very much going to be just kind of building that platform that will then kind of put the sexual wellness stuff on top of.
So I love that you say that because I think the assumption sometimes is if I'm going to sex therapy, the only thing I can talk about is sex. And what if my partner's not ready? What if I'm not ready? Or what if there's other stuff that plays into it? Say, I don't trust my partner emotionally or we're really disconnected. So I love that you highlight that.
Yeah. And just the idea that it's 4 to 6 sessions. It's just so common. And I laugh at that. I mean, because it's such a medical model and there's a lot of evidence-based, insurance, I think, pushes evidence-based, but there's a lot of content like this that there's just much more involvement that's needed in a therapeutic way to, like you said, build trust. We can be vulnerable to even talk about that, especially with couples where partner might not even know the other person has an interest, which I'm sure you probably see a lot of.
Yeah. How do you handle that? If couples come in with differences in desire for kink, desires for sex, the different pieces?
Yeah. So to start, desire discrepancy, mismatched libidos, that is the number one reason I'm seeing couples. Sometimes it involves an interesting kink, but a lot of times it doesn't. And so that's something that, I think is actually really, really common. And a lot of wonderful work can be done around that issue. Specifically when one person is interested in kink and the other is not. I think the first thing that we do is help them just communicate with one another and cultivate a sense of acceptance around each person's interests and desires. And so it's never a situation where I, as the sex therapist, am like encouraging the person to join their partner in their interest in kink. I think everyone should be empowered to have the desires and the interests and the libido that they have and let that be perfectly okay. But I think a lot of wonderful things can come from openness, acceptance, understanding, like, why are you interested and excited by this kink? What is it about, this thing that is exciting to you? And is there a way that we can kind of meet in the middle? Maybe not expressing the kink in the way that you see it, but in a way that is exciting and fulfilling and comfortable and accessible for both of us.
And
That.
do you experience where, say, there's discrepancy in engagement in kink? Do you feel it's a partner where they're trying to relate to the one who's maybe not into it as much, personalization? Do you have to navigate that quite a bit where they're personalizing and they're like, well, what's wrong with me? Am I not good enough that we have to include these things?
Yes, very often. Absolutely. And I think part of the way that we work through that is kind of that depersonalization, that maybe it's not a deficiency. Very often it's not a deficiency in the other partner. It's an additional interest. It's an additional piece of themselves that they want to explore, something that feels novel and adventurous.
That's why I love the curiosity piece.
Yes.
Because that's
Mhm.
like the ideal position that I love when couples are talking about vulnerable things. Show
Yeah.
curiosity, but it's very hard when we personalize it. So you might have to go into that depersonalization, which I think is so, so important, especially around intimacy of any sort.
Mhm.
It's so vulnerable that it's so easy to get defensive.
I also
Mhm.
think about the intersection of, say, faith
Mhm.
and kink, or family values or roles or conversations and kink. How do you handle that where some of it is more value based or home based?
Mhm.
And if I do this, I'm a quote unquote deviant and therefore I am bad and doomed to hell or whatever it might be.
Mm.
Yeah, absolutely. Really happy y'all brought this up. This is actually a big part of my work, working with folks who are, actively in religious spaces or previously in religious spaces and trying to kind of square their interest and desire in kinks. And also, I see this with a lot of my female clients, especially folks who might be moms. Like, how can I be a mom and also be interested in some of these things? Or, how can I be a feminist and be a strong woman and also have this desire to be a submissive or a masochist? Like, so sometimes it feels like they come into direct conflict with one another. And so we talk a lot about sexual integrity, which is something that I learned through my certification program, which I use all the time because I really love the idea. It's about how to kind of reconcile these two parts of yourself and that they don't necessarily need to come into conflict because you're the one who gets to decide what you're okay with. You don't need to necessarily look at these external structures and let them define what's okay, what's not okay, what's good, what's bad. So as long as you feel integrous about your sexual behavior, your sexual practices, that's really the important part.
I think about, say, from like a biblical standpoint, I imagine that can be hard, right? Even if
Mhm.
society doesn't know that I'm engaged in kink,
Mhm.
what if God does? What's he thinking? What's he doing? Right? Or
Mhm.
judging me? And I've heard that before with clients
Mhm.
where it's come up of even clients who want to explore non-monogamy of this is starkly against my religious beliefs. So what does that mean for me?
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we work through a lot in my practice. I think at the root of all of this is a sense of shame. And so rather than, challenging any type of like religious beliefs or religious structure or morality, that kind of thing, I really kind of dig into, let's unpack the shame around this and really start to work on that.
I love that.
The narrative, the
Mhm.
narratives that drive kind of our perception, expectations.
Or if I believe that and my partner wants to engage in kink, am I judging them? How do we handle the shame when it's other based?
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And that is honestly one of the more trickier things that I'll work with in my practice. The idea of defensiveness came up a few minutes ago, and that's usually what I see as kind of like the next step. Someone will become defensive if they're personalizing some of this and will very often go to this shaming place of, I can't believe you're into this. This is so wrong and gross and bad and all of the things. And that becomes really, really difficult because at that point, it starts to kind of undermine the respect that's in the relationship, the communication. That can be a really hard place to be.
Do you find that this is one of those aspects that could decide, like have a couple decide want to stay in a relationship or not?
Yes and no. I would say that I've seen folks who are in early stages of relationship use this as one piece to decide, hey, do we have a long-term compatibility? And I have seen folks kind of go their separate ways at that point and saying, hey, this is just not going to work because we're in very different places. Now, for the folks who have been in really long-term relationships and their lives are incredibly integrated, mortgage and kids and community and all of that kind of stuff, less so, but it's really difficult to navigate when we get to kind of that impasse of, this is something I really want. It's not something I'm going to consider. And then where do we go from here?
Mm. And say a couple decides and they work and you're doing a great job and they're like, yes, okay, let's explore this. What do the conversations look like in terms of boundaries and
Good question.
Yeah.
Consent.
consent? Like what does that process look like in helping them establish something where they both feel safe and comfortable?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I try to model consent for clients like right from the jump, right from day one. So asking for their consent and their permission as these things come into the room, or if I'm about to offer, some resources or ideas, asking for their consent before I do so. And even though it might seem not necessarily redundant, but like obvious, right? I want to model that so that they start to see that that's normalized and then start to use it in their communication, asking one another for consent before they're going into places that might feel a little bit more vulnerable. And so, I think just kind of laying the foundation of consent is really important. I truly believe that kinky folks do boundaries better than anybody else. And one of the reasons I believe that is because there are so many resources to talk about boundaries when it comes to kink. I mean, we are well equipped in terms of spreadsheets and, these long lists and, yes, no, no, maybe lists, or using kind of the traffic light system of red, yellow, green, hard limits, soft limits. Like this, the groundwork has been laid in terms of how to have these conversations. I really encourage my couples, start slow. Like nobody needs to come crashing through the wall like the Kool-Aid man. Like that's just going to scare people. So just like don't go don't go to the most hardcore stuff and be like, what about this? Start slow and really kind of work your way up that list. But yeah, there's so many great resources out there available.
I love that. I think about too, and I'm trying to think of how to word this, but I think about popular media, right? 50 Shades of Grey. And that's people's base understanding, perhaps only understanding of kink, even BDSM, this sort of thing. What's it like for you as a sex therapist to witness these Hollywood depictions of how this
I
goes?
love this. Yeah.
Oh, thanks for bringing that up, Kim. Yeah, no, but seriously, because there's a question I get a lot and I love to talk about it. I am not a fan. I'm not a fan of 50 Shades of Grey, primarily because of the way that BDSM, specifically the SM part, the sadism masochism part, is heavily pathologized. And so, spoiler alert, Christian Grey has this like moral crisis of conscience that, he's a sadist and something is wrong with him. And he's been irreparably broken and harmed. And at a certain point in the book, the couple goes their separate ways. And in part, he's thinking that it's a good thing because he wants to like protect his partner from the deviance and darkness, within him. So I think it actually really heavily pathologized kink and BDSM. Now, it makes for a great story. It's very highly entertaining. But unfortunately, yeah, I think it was a somewhat negative depiction. And what I like to remind folks is that, like, people who practice kink and BDSM, they're like regular people. They go to Trader Joe's and they like clean their toilets and they go to work. They're not all billionaires who have helicopters and a dungeon in their basement, right? And so I think I would like to see media that just normalizes BDSM and kink rather than this like very sensational, pathologized story.
That's why I bring it up, because for some people, they hadn't heard anything about it until especially the movie came out.
Yeah.
And then that's their only exposure. So they assume, much like the porn industry, right? What I witness is how it has to go, or this is like the creme de la creme, or I don't know. It just sets the standard or expectations. And I have a feeling it's a lot more nuanced than what Hollywood portrays.
Do you mind defining BDSM for those who might not be familiar with that acronym?
Yeah. Absolutely. So one point to note is that kink and BDSM are not the same thing. And so I know sometimes folks will use those interchangeably, understandably, right? Because I think at this point, just kind of given how it's worked its way into the culture and mainstream, I believe that BDSM would probably be the most well-known of the kinks. And so very often folks use those interchangeably. So kink is the big umbrella under which BDSM lives, but there's many other kinks that exist that aren't BDSM. So BDSM is an acronym, and there are 3 sub acronyms, I guess, kind of nested within that. So the BD is for bondage and discipline. The DS is for dominance and submission. And then the SM is for sadism and masochism. So if you think about rope play or impact play or power exchanged relationships, all of those would be BDSM.
What's impact play? Forgive the ignorance.
Yeah. So impact play is a kink in which folks enjoy either giving or receiving some type of sensation. I think people often go right to pain and go right to like, oh, these people must be super into the pain aspect. But sometimes it's not even about the pain, it's just about the sensation. So impact play typically uses implements, so floggers, crops, canes, those types of things. And usually one person is giving and one person is receiving. Sometimes that's existing within a dominant submissive frame. Other times it's just kind of casual and pickup play, like you connect with somebody at a local community space and engage in that kind of play, and then just kind of go your separate ways. And there's not like a defined relationship around it.
So interesting. So besides BDSM, what other types of kinks would fall under the umbrella of kink?
Yeah. So one of the more common ones that I think people are familiar with because it's been depicted in media, foot fetish is a big one. And I think folks are somewhat familiar with that. Group play and public sex, so exhibitionism and then voyeurism, its kind of counterpart, would also be a kink. And folks are familiar with that as well. Cuckolding is a little bit less familiar with some folks, but that would be another common kink that we see and hear about.
Can you explain that one?
Yeah, so cuckolding is a practice in which typically a male partner is viewing his female partner having sex with another man, but not participating. Like it's not a threesome where everybody is, just witnessing.
They're the inverse in a heterosexual relationship.
Yes, there is the inverse as well. Mm-hmm.
I love that you're pointing out all the different types because it runs a gamut, right?
Mm-hmm.
Hence the definition is so broad.
Yes. But I think people, when you hear the word kink, your brain goes somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And yet there's so many more pieces to it,
Hmm.
more options.
Yeah. One of the common sayings in the kink world is your kink is not my kink. And it's often, abbreviated as an acronym. And I think it's just such a wonderful reminder that to be open and accepting and inclusive, it doesn't mean that you have to be into everything or be willing to participate in everything, but that you can still hold the space for people's interests and be, yeah, open and inclusive and supportive.
You spoke earlier about starting slow or starting like in a softer type of kink versus hardcore. Can you speak to what might fall along that bridge of what are some softer places people can start all the way up to?
The Kool-Aid man.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, so bondage is a wonderful example of that. So, say a partner is really interested in rope play and bondage. We don't necessarily need to go immediately to, okay, go to Studio Friction in Denver and, like get hung up by this big rope suspension thing. Like that could feel intimidating and that could feel like a lot. And so starting slow could look like, all right, can your partner use something like a necktie to restrain your hands? And then the two of you just see how that feels. And in this work, I'm encouraging people to really get into their bodies and see how everything is feeling, right? And be really aware and mindful of how am I responding to this? Am I enjoying this? What's coming up for me as I'm engaging in this? And we kind of do that in stages. And so that would be like a good step one of, is there some type of silk scarf or necktie that could be used as a wrist restraint? And then moving forward to, okay, what about like the fuzzy handcuffs that we find at adult shops? And eventually kind of going to the rope itself and, moving in that direction.
I love that. So allowing people to almost desensitize or I forget what the
Put some
phrase is. I'm
floaties
thinking,
on and swimming before you
yeah,
Yeah. And
talk about systematic desensitization.
yeah.
Yeah.
mhm. And knowing that at any moment, either partner can say no. I think that that's so important because very often the person who's maybe not super on board with kink will say, well, I don't even want to open this door because if I tie her hands with a silk scarf, is that then like signing on that I'm just going to go through this whole process and we're going to end up, at a rope studio? And so, really drilling down into consent and that either person can say no, can stop at any moment. And it's really interesting because sometimes the person who is really on board with kink maybe has been watching kink porn or content or reading erotica and having fantasies. Sometimes they will engage in some of this stuff in practice and realize like, oh, I don't like this. I don't actually like the way that this feels, or this just kind of isn't for me. And that's totally okay too. Sometimes fantasy can just stay fantasy and we can just enjoy it in that way.
I was going to ask, how common is kink? So when we talk about kink, people think it's like this small subset that hides in the dark. I don't think it really is. Can you speak to that?
Everybody
Yeah,
has
I've,
definition of anything.
right. It depends on how you define kink. I've found a few statistics that suggest that fantasizing about kink is actually incredibly common. Over 40% of people report engaging in some type of fantasy around kink. And then I've found data that says about 20% of folks have engaged or are currently engaging in some practice of kink. So it's not this tiny, minuscule part of the population. It's actually a really common interest. The difference, though, is that people don't talk about it because of that worry, I think, the worry of being judged, the worry of being seen differently. And so it's remains a really private thing.
One thing I'm curious about is you're working with a couple. They're starting to explore. They come back to you in process. What are some things that come up in process?
Yeah. So oftentimes folks will note anxiety that's coming up as they're engaging in this. And so that's a wonderful thing to process and unpack. Excuse me. The other thing is, I really like to talk about the level of connection versus disconnection. And so, in these activities, as you're exploring kink, are you feeling connected to your partner? How are you nurturing that connection and staying present, in the moment? Or is it feeling like the additional elements of kink are actually promoting disconnection? And, is that something that we need to figure out and then unpack?
I love that because the thing that's been swirling in my head as we're talking through this is and this anecdotally from couples I see, and I'm not specialized in sex therapy or anything, it comes up a lot, is that one might venture into the partner's interest, then they kind of feel different about their partner. They
Mhm.
might lose respect or feel more disconnected as you what is like how do you work with that?
That's hard. That's really hard. And a place where I see that most often is when I'm working with a heterosexual couple and the man in the relationship expresses interest in being submissive. And what it does is it completely kind of flips some of the gender roles that societally we're kind of taught are correct. It flips that all on their heads. And so that can be a really difficult thing because, here's this person who really wants to have their sexual interests and desires acknowledged and honored and respected. And then here's this other person who is feeling really different about her partner and is having a hard time seeing him in the same way. And so that's really hard to navigate. Typically where I'll go with that is thinking about, okay, can the kink kind of stay contained to sex in the bedroom? And how in, the other parts of the relationship are we able to kind of keep things stable and keep that connection looking like the way that it has been?
Yeah, I love this so much that you're bringing it up because it's just feeding into the questions that I have about the role and how we view our partner through this. And like, how do you balance this? Like, you have a role that's in one part of your life, but then you come out and you have this societal role that you're fulfilling. And, you know, can you compartmentalize it or is it a balance? Like, what is that looking like? Or is it dependent on the couple?
Yeah, I mean, that's a wonderful question. I think that it really is up to the individual or the couple. One of the things that's really, really common in the kink world is powerful ass kicking women wanting to inhabit a more sexually submissive role. Incredibly common. And it would be really surprising to a lot of folks who might know that woman in like her day to day life to know that she is interested in some of these submissive acts and behaviors. In terms of how much this gets integrated into day to day life, that's really up to the individual and the couple. So, for example, some couples will say that they're bedroom only. It's a phrase that's commonly used in kink, meaning this is the way that we like to engage and play when we're engaged in sex and intimacy, but otherwise it's not integrated into our daily lives. Now, running the spectrum from that, there are other couples who practice what they call 24/7 TPE, which stands for Total Power Exchange. And that means that kink, and usually primarily dominance and submission, has integrated every aspect of their lives. And so, one partner is usually making decisions for the other, and it's just very much the frame that they're using to exist in their relationship.
Interesting.
Have you come across couples have a hard time? Like, yeah, they set these boundaries, talk about this internally, they have a hard time following that or not having a different viewpoint on their partner and not being able to differentiate if there's
Yeah, say more about that.
so when you think about like in a heterosexual couple, there's a submission out in the bedroom and like we're keeping it in there. Male partner submissive, we're keeping it in there. But outside, well, no, that happened. I can't just like forget that.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. And again, I think this really is up to the couple and what they're wanting. If they're wanting, it to permeate other parts of the relationship, then I think both folks really need to be on board with that. And then the reverse, if they're really wanting it to kind of stay compartmentalized and just in the bedroom. I think that needs to be a mutually agreed upon thing as well. And of course, there's a spectrum here where it doesn't have to be kind of this all or nothing thing. But yeah, that can be a big point of contention where one person's under the impression of this is just the way that we engage in sex and have play, and the other person is, finding ways to kind of bring it into their dynamic and how they're relating with each other.
So interesting.
It's very fascinating.
I even think about like anal play for men. Sometimes I've heard in couples before of if a man wants to, say a heterosexual male wants to engage in anal play, it must mean he's gay or bisexual. It must mean
Yeah.
that something is awry. Can you speak to that piece?
Yeah, absolutely. I will die on this hill. Heterosexual men have it really difficult in this way where they are not given any kind of room to explore before all of these assumptions are made. So, when you think about a woman who is exploring her sexuality or, is engaging in bisexuality, that kind of thing, typically she's given way more room to just kind of be adventurous, be explorative. Sometimes women will say that they had, a gay phase in college, right? Where it's something that they enjoyed and now they're just kind of like moving on with their lives. That doesn't work for men. It's almost as if once men deviate from this very rigid, narrow path of like hyper heterosexuality, then all bets are off and all of these assumptions are made. So I do a lot of that work actually with men, really unpacking this hyper masculinity, hyper heterosexuality stuff and promoting acceptance around exploring their sexuality without feeling like they're taking on a ton of shame.
I love that.
As we're talking about this, like how many narratives do we have to battle around this?
Culturally, family, religious, friends,
Yeah.
politics. I mean, you
Disney.
name it.
Sorry, I have
Facts. Facts.
Yeah.
When you think about sex therapy and kink, are there any myths that you want to bust for our listeners?
Yes. Well, the first we already talked about is that it's uncommon because it's not, this tiny percentage of the population. I would suggest that if you think about your friend group or your social circle, there is at least one person there who either has fantasized about kink, watches kinky porn, reads kinky erotica, or is engaging in kink. And so it's way more common than I think a lot of people realize. The other myth is that interest in kink has to originate and stem from some type of early traumatic experience or abuse or some kind of fracture early on, which is not the case. For some people, they do have a history of trauma, or they do have a history of difficult things happening in their lives, but it's not like a requirement. It's not like the birthplace of kink is, trauma. And then the other thing that I think is really important to dispel is that this myth that kink is inherently dangerous to women. I think oftentimes, especially in media, we're seeing especially dominance and submission portrayed in this way that it's usually a male dominant and a female submissive. And I think a narrative is forming around the idea that kink is a way to abuse or subjugate or control women, which absolutely is not kink, because kink is, the backbone of it is enthusiastic consent and mutually agreed upon activities. And so it just does not fit with the idea of controlling or subjugating women.
Appreciate that.
Yeah.
Are there any last little tidbits you want our viewers to know about kink or sex therapy? And then do you mind sharing a bit about if people want to get in contact with you, how they might do that?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few things. If you're interested in kink, how to do this safely, I think is a really, really important thing. So if you're interested in kink, seek out a sex therapist and explore that and start to understand what this community looks like. Also, see if there are any community resources in your area where you can actually meet other people who are practicing kink and start to get to know them. We're lucky enough in Northern Colorado and by extension, the Denver metro area to have a really big, thriving kink community, which is so awesome. So, very often when folks have kink communities, there will be events called munches, where it's a non sexual gathering, usually at a restaurant or a bar, where it just brings people together who are interested in kink. And it's a wonderful way to actually meet other real humans who are interested in this. The other piece is that very often community spaces like dungeons or rope studios or adult toy stores will have classes and workshops. And that's a wonderful way to kind of dip your toes in and really start to understand, is this something that I want to do? And if so, how do I actually practice it? And so that I think is really important. The other piece is if you're looking for a sex therapist, be really, really, really discerning. ASECT, which is our national governing body, they have a directory where you can find certified sex therapists, throughout the country, which is really helpful. You can also, if somebody is listing sex therapy in their profile or in their information, be really thorough about vetting. Like, don't be afraid to ask them questions. Are you currently in any specific training program? What training have you done? And then you can dig into the nuance. How do you feel about kink? Is a wonderful question to ask a potential sex therapist. How do you feel about porn? Are you sex positive? Give me an example of how you're sex positive. All of that kind of stuff. Sex therapists who really know their stuff will have answers for you, will have answers ready. So, really be discerning about sex therapists that you're entering into work with. And I really want to emphasize this, not to gatekeep and say, okay, sex therapists, certified sex therapists are the only people who can work with clients, but because I can't tell you how many folks I've worked with who have reported really damaging and injurious experiences with untrained therapists marketing themselves as sex therapists. And it doesn't have to even be like ill intentioned, right? It can be as simple as an untrained person having some type of facial reaction or like recoiling or saying something really simple as like, oh, you're into that? And then boom, right? Like damage has been done because somebody has been extremely vulnerable in sharing this stuff and receives that type of feedback. And that person may never seek out therapy ever again. So be really, really discerning about searching out a sex therapist. The best way to keep up with me is on Instagram. I'm really active on Instagram. You can find me at SX Therapy with Andrea. So sex without the E, because Instagram doesn't like it when I say sex. So SX Therapy with Andrea. I host Sexual Health Fridays, where I pick a topic every Friday about sexual health, sexual wellness, and I'll just talk about it for a little while just to kind of promote sex education because the vast majority of us received terrible sex education and to just normalize these conversations, right? That there are people out here talking about this stuff and that can be okay. So that's the best way to keep up with me and get an idea of what I'm doing. Currently, I'm running a women's group focused on non-monogamy, and I'll be announcing a few other groups that I'll be hosting here in the next couple of months. My website is junipercounselingsolutions.com. My practice is Juniper Counseling. So those are a few other ways to get a hold of me.
And we'll definitely be providing the links for you guys to click on so you can find Andrea and also on the exec and to find a sex therapist.
Greg, do you have any final questions?
I mean, I have so many, and I think we can hedge it for another episode because I feel like this is a very important topic that doesn't get covered because of a lot of the stigma. And
yeah, I appreciate that you've added so much light to something that often gets cast to the dark. And then it doesn't have to be this taboo, shameful, deviant thing that people often assume it is.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate you saying that. I'm pretty relaxed in session. I like to use humor when appropriate. kind of silly and goofy sometimes. And I think that that goes a long way in terms of, again, normalizing and being able to just kind of accept something that I think does get seen as dark, deviant, bad, that kind of thing. Yeah.
It's interesting. If you go by that definition, only missionary. If you do anything outside of missionary, you're kinky. Then there's stigma against you only do missionary.
Yes.
Or
Truth.
like you just can't win.
You can't win.
Yeah.
Yep.
Can't win.
Just do you. Just do.
Yes.
And your partner.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Andrea. We are beyond grateful to have you on our podcast today, where you've helped us get kinky and talk about things that people are probably wondering about and are just not talking about.
Mhm. Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun. As you can tell, this is one of my favorite things to talk about. And if I could, I'd talk about it all day. So thank you again.
Yeah, we love it.
As always, if anyone has any questions or feedback, you can email us at relationshipsinsideout@gmail.com. You can follow us on YouTube or, of course, through our podcast on Spotify or any major forms. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.